I was again in another fascinating discussion once where somebody was saying to me, Hollywood says there are only 7 stories. And I said, well, actually, I think there are only 2 stories. And they date way, way back to the very first opportunity, really, in human history for stories to be told, which one assumes was when the human brain had evolved enough to have some kind of excess capacity. People would be sitting around in a cave in some, really primitive circumstance with a fire burning at the mouth of the cave to keep the saber-toothed tigers out. And presumably there must have been leisure hours and enough kind of mental capacity to invent narrative. And so narrative will have been invented and stories will have been told. And if you imagine sitting in that cave, really there are only 2 stories. One story is about you're sitting in the cave, frightened about what's outside of the cave, which is really the serial killer story. That's how it's evolved now, 100,000 years later. You're in your house and there's somebody on the loose. There's a fantastic line in all our subconsciousness, there's something out there. So that's one story. You're in the cave and there's something out there. The other story is somebody from the cave goes out there to check it out, comes back maybe days, maybe years later, which would then be the Odyssey type of story where they come back many years later and tell about their adventures. So there's really only 2 stories. You're either in the cave, worried about what's out there, or you're outside the cave, dealing with it. And Reacher is the guy outside the cave.
And we all need that outrider, or that guy who can work outside and write or protect or whatever it is that needs to happen.
And we need that kind of narrative. I mean, I think that people again say, why is this genre so popular? And it's really because this is the genre. This is really what narrative began as, I think. Stories of tension, danger, and eventually resolution and safety. This is the story. Everything else has been added later.
Well, so we could agree that you have certainly, as a consequence of making Reacher a free spirit, you can change your setting. Every book. I mean, you can take him wherever he goes. Sometimes at his own behest, and he just walked. I know in your second book, for example, Die Trying, he is just walking down the street and the whole case comes at him. I mean, this woman rushes out of the dry cleaners and somebody snatches her right in front and he just reacts. Yeah,
and I caught some, it was decision time then really, because I caught some criticism for that the idea is I wanted this loner with no connections at all, but then a writer has a tactical problem with that because how does he get involved in anything? And it has to be by that kind of just blatant wrong place, wrong time situation. As you say, he was walking down the street and the woman ran into him. And I kind of figured that's how I wanted to keep the series, that it was absolutely just bad luck, that he was never dragged into anything on purpose. It just happened to him. But I realized that you can't do that book after book, just have one outrageous coincidence after another. So several of the other books have been much more purposeful, where somebody has sought him out or tracked him down and asked him to be involved, which then opens up another kind of scenario where, of course, what are his reasons for getting involved? He can say no. If he says yes, why is he saying yes? And that kind of gives you another dimension of him.
It does, and then of course at the end you have the additional dimension of how does he become uninvolved again.
Yeah.
Because really the way you've done this requires him not to acquire baggage. There is one book where there's a bridge over with a relationship, but those of us who knew you figured that it wasn't going to prosper. And I thought you handled it very well, but for the guy to be this kind of character, he really doesn't get to keep baggage book to book.
He doesn't, but I think the way that works, it's really multifaceted, because I think that he would actually quite like to get involved. It's not his pure choice that he doesn't. There's always something that kind of prevents it. And of course, the other thing that might prevent it is that it's not his choice alone. It takes 2 to tango, and so the woman in any such situation is going to have her say. And he hangs out with smart women, and if the woman is smart, she can see that, well, maybe this is a very nice guy, very attractive for, a week, but do I really want to stick around with this guy forever? So it's really up to her as much as it is up to him. And in a couple of the books, the woman has made the choice that he should get back on the road.
Very true. It's interesting, too, when you said that, I was just realizing, are all of the books, is it a woman that really instigates I'm trying to remember. The first one, let's talk about the first one, Killing Floor. He comes into town on the bus.
Right.
It's a small town in Georgia, isn't it?
That's right, south of Atlanta.
And he's just on the bus.
Yeah, he's on the bus just kind of staring out of the window and sees the highway sign pointing to the town. And it rings a bell in his mind that he's heard this name in connection with an old legend about something that happened to an old blues musician. And because this is a guy who has nothing to do and nowhere to go, the idea of walking 14 miles actually from the highway into this town to check out or just be where this old blues legend might have disappeared seems to be a perfectly valid way of spending his day. So he makes the bus stop, scrambles down the highway bank, and walks into town, whereupon he's immediately arrested because there was a vicious homicide that morning, and he's the only stranger in town, and he seems like a convenient patsy for the police department to arrest.
So there, in that book, too, there is coincidence at work. I mean, it's
Total.
just a total accident that he's
Yeah.
walked into town and the homicide has coincidentally gone down.
Yeah.
And then it turns out, of course, there's some other connections of a personal nature that, you know.
There are, which is, again, a coincidence. And so that is a fairly coincidence-heavy book. But, a story, I joke with people that the books where nothing happens to Reacher, I still write them, but the publisher won't publish them. So you've got to see it as these are, isolated adventures that have happened to him. Just it's not like every day he spends in mortal danger. It's just once in a while.
Well, that's very true because we're dealing with time. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
every day we're dealing
No,
with, and
it's
we're
not.
dealing with and there's vast periods of time, presumably, in between the books where he's
content and peaceful. Yeah.
right, going along doing
Yeah.
his thing. But nevertheless, the first two books, I think coincidence did play a fairly
did.
heavy role. And then when you get to Tripwire,
Tripwire is the third one, and that was where I changed it slightly so that he is actually perfectly happy doing nothing at all. He's in Key West, and a private detective turns up that he assumes is some kind of skip tracer looking for this guy called Jack Reacher, and he says, "Are you Jack Reacher?" And Reacher says no, because he just shies away from any kind of involvement. Then he finds out later there was a very good reason why he should have actually said yes. So he was playing catch-up for part of the book, trying to find out who was the detective and who'd hired him and why did they want him. And so that's how he gets into that adventure.
right, and that is different because that's somebody who came looking for him. It wasn't
That's
him
right.
stumbling into. Did
Exactly.
you do that in part as a reaction to Die Trying?
Yeah, I did, because I took the critic's point that it would become formulaic if every book started out exactly the same with some kind of coincidental involvement.
Right, so you're back to that first page dilemma. You sell some
Yeah.
of it, but
Plus, in a sense, it's a character issue as well, because it does enrich the character, but the idea that somebody somewhere knows him well enough to feel that he's worth seeking out. You see what I mean? It's all action and procedure, but it also tells you something about the value of the character, that other people are going to do all these lengths to find him. So it's a way of describing character without really overtly describing a character.
well, it certainly affirms his role as a knight errant, so
Well,
to
it
speak.
does, yeah, and as a valuable one, and one that somebody appreciates enough to actually do some hard work in tracking him down.
Sure, and so for this book, we do delve a bit into his military background because the reason he's being tracked down stems from his former life.
Yeah, that's right. In that book, Tripwire, the reason he's being tracked down is that his friend and old commanding officer had been investigating something unofficially, but he's investigating it only because somebody he met at the cardiac clinic had asked him to. So we understand straight away that this old commanding officer is sick, and actually he dies before he's produced any results. And so the people that he was helping out, their problem is still unresolved, and with the intervention of the old guy's daughter, Reacher is asked to take on the responsibility.